that was good. That was awesome. So the next couple of presentations are supposed to give you some help in starting your own startup. First one will be about government funding and support. And our speaker, Dr. נילי Mendel-Blit, represents Israel at the EU Research and Development Council, as well as the Israeli Space Committee at the Israeli R&D Council, as she drives the future funding opportunities for startups. נילי got her PhD in computer science and cognitive science, and her postdoctoral research was conducted in Paris, France, at the École Polytechnique. Before joining the government sector, she was in the Israeli high-tech as a VP for technology and marketing. I also want to have a special thank you to נילי for setting up 2 days ago a workshop on remote sensing as part of her organization ISERD, which represents the EU Horizon programs in Israel. And that workshop was really, really successful. Maybe next year it will be in the vicinity of the conference at the same time. So please welcome נילי.
Thank you, Ofer. Indeed, we had a successful conference that was a good introduction to all the topics that were discussed yesterday and today. So for my presentation about public funding for space innovation in Israel, for those of you who were here in the opening session yesterday morning, the head of ESA, Dr. Werner, posed a very important question to governments around the world, asking what is the role of governments in the new space era. So if we look at the old space, what we call old space, although of course it's the prevailing model still today and will stay with us for many years to come, probably. In this old space that we know, the governments, the space agencies, are the one that owns all the space activities. So they define the missions, and not only define the missions, but they also define exactly how to achieve the missions. So they actually say which technologies, which components they want, which solutions, and then the governments place tenders to the market with very detailed requirements. And of course, the government incurs, in this case, all the cost and all the risk, because they are the ones saying what to do. In this model, clearly, it's very difficult to see new disruptive innovation coming from the market, because everything is defined in advance. In the new space model, we talk about bottom-up disruptive innovation, which is independent, at least to some extent, of the policies and the priorities that the government sets. Again, the big question is how the government can play a role in this new space era. We want the government to fund bottom-up innovation. This funding, it doesn't have to be covering the full cost, because the government is not defining what to do. The market is defining, and the funding by the government should be seen mostly as risk sharing the risk with the private money and the entrepreneurs. The government could help in other ways, for example, to provide shared infrastructure, testing facilities, for example, in space, which are so expensive and small entrepreneurs cannot have the money to support this. They can provide favorable regulation, and they can serve as a customer for the very risky business. So my main message for this presentation is actually a good message for entrepreneurs in Israel, and that is that the Israeli government has been practicing a bottom-up funding approach, just as we talked, already for over 40 years, via the Office of the Chief Scientist in the Ministry of Economy, and now with the Israel Innovation Authority, which is replacing the Office of the Chief Scientist. So the Office of the Chief Scientist concept was already set by the government in the 60s, and then in the 80s, the government passed a law for R&D funding, which we still use today, it hasn't changed much, which is using exactly the same principles, listening to the market defines what they want, no priorities from the government in funding, and we'll see it in a minute. And this approach is seen by many researchers around the world and by books such as the Startup Nation. It's seen as a key factor in the emergence and the success of the high-tech sector in Israel. But if we look at grants, these are, for example, grants from the Office of Chief Scientist in 2015. We don't see space there. We see mainly grants for software. Maybe we can use it. Whoops. Mainly, well, I leave it without. Mainly with, we see grants for software, for communication, medical devices, electronic and electro-optics. Of course, some of it is for space, but they weren't defined per se as such. And it's time now to use this tool, this funding approach for the new space area, for the new entrepreneurs. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is discuss about two main funding routes that are available for Israeli entrepreneurs and innovators. The first is via the Israel Innovation Authority, again, formerly the OCS till 2016. And the other one is the European Union Framework Program for Research and Innovation, Horizon 2020. You may ask why an Israeli government representative is talking about the EU Framework Program. Well, that's because Israel is an associated country to this very big R&D program. We've been associated country for over 20 years now. And this means the Israeli government and also the Innovation Authority and the Israeli Higher Education Council is putting its share into this big R&D budget of the EU, and this means that entities from Israel are entitled to participate in it. So we see it in the Israel Innovation Authority as another funding channel, an indirect funding channel, where we give the money to the EU, and then the Israelis compete and take a share in this environment. I will not talk in this presentation about the funding of the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Israeli Space Agency is funding the old way, but I will only mention it where there are some programs where the Israel Innovation Authority and the Israeli Space Agency are joining forces together. I didn't mention before, by the way, that this whole approach of funding, of course, the funding for the new space, at least in my view, doesn't have to come instead of the old model. We don't want, of course, to destroy or not support the old industry and its requirements. It's still leading the main missions in space, and we've heard the plea yesterday from IAI, from Ofer Doron and others for the traditional government support that we still need it there. So I'll go through some specific examples of programs in those two channels that are specifically relevant for the space entrepreneurs. So first about the Israel Innovation Authority. There is the R&D fund law, which I mentioned, which was defined in the 80s, and that's the main incentive programs. Again, it's a bottom-up. It's covering all areas, all sectors, so including space. We don't define the sectors in the government. It's a conditional grant, so the companies have to repay the received funding, but only in the case that the technology reaches commercial success. We keep the notion of shared risk. Okay, the government doesn't pay everything. If you get a grant, you have to, as a company, to put a match to the grant, and it's usually the basic law is to pay only up to 50% of the approved expenditures. The government doesn't ask for any equity, only that the IP will stay in Israel in order to help the growth and the prosperity of the Israel economy later. And the projects, again, are not defined by priorities, but rather by generic criteria, how innovative the technology is, what is the commercial potential that we see there, and the competence of the applicants. And then there are some specific tools for space. First, there is the Israel Innovation Authority and the Israel Space Agency joint space technology program since 2013, whose goal is specifically to strengthen the knowledge and technology of space in Israel. So it's targeting companies developing new products in this area. You see the list of areas, although this is expanding, I think, and we see today many new areas such as Earth observation applications and more that may be entering the scope of this tool. The grants here, since the risk in space is much higher, the grant percentage is higher as well. It's up to 85% of the expenses, and the evaluation and selection of projects is done jointly by the Israel Innovation Authority and the Israeli Space Agency. See, the next call deadline for this year will come on the second half of 2019. Another route which may be relevant for many space technologies is the Miimad program, which is a program jointly managed with the Ministry of Defense on dual-use R&D. The goal there is to promote R&D which on one hand contributes to Israel national security as defined by Ministry of Defense, and on the other hand that has commercial potential as defined by the Israel Innovation Authority. And you see the programs here. Again, the funding rate here is a little bit higher. It's above 50%, 50 to 60%, depend on who is applying, industry or academia. And again, it's joint evaluation and selection by both ministries with the next call deadline coming in April. Then there are bilateral programs. There is a bilateral program that was signed in 2013 with Space Florida, specifically to promote aerospace R&D. The example we've seen before, the presentation by STEMRAD, for example, was a project that is funded with Lockheed Martin under this program. And again, it's a joint evaluation on both sides with the next call opening in the fourth quarter of 2018. This example with Space Florida is one example of the general bilateral programs in the Israel Innovation Authorities that are based on government-to-government international agreements that are signed with specific governments, with specific countries. And again, they are doing, the budget is from both governments. Each side is funding their own participants, but the projects have to be by two entities from both countries. And here the grant again is up to 50%, but it's a little bit wider in scope what are considered as eligible expenditures. Here you see a list of all the grant agreement, the government-to-government bilateral agreements that were signed so far. And based on these agreements, calls are published each year. It depends, the dates differ and the scope differs. Sometimes the scope is completely open. Sometimes it's for a specific area or priority, again, based on discussion with the bilateral government. So this was just a touch of programs from the Israel Innovation Authority. We'll hear a little bit more, another example in the next presentation, but from Gilat, but I'll go quickly about the other two, which is the EU Framework Program, Horizon 2020. It's a huge R&D program, about 80 billion euros now for 7 years. The world's largest platform, as far as we know, for international R&D cooperation. And if we look at this old space, new space view, then we can, I think it's kind of in the middle. It joins both views, because the program here you see in the slide, the structure of the program, it's divided into sub-programs, one of which is space. And each such sub-program has its own budget, has its own committee with representatives from the different countries, and it defines its own working program and then publish calls. So it's on one hand following the old model, because the EU has its priorities, flagship programs, for example, Copernicus, Galileo, the new satellite communication government initiative. And then the calls are asking to support those programs. But on the other hand, the forms of the calls is that they more pose a solution, but not pose a problem, but not necessarily the solution. So it does have some space for new ideas to come in. Very quickly, this is, for example, the calls that are open now for 2018-2019. You see the various technologies, space segment technologies in generic technologies, robotics, electrical propulsion, Earth observation technologies, SATCOM technologies, launching system technologies. There are some topics for space science instrumentation. A lot of topics and budget about market take-up of Earth observation and GNSS-based application. Some topics on security of space environment, and also on space entrepreneurship and education. These are all open calls that are open right now, and you are welcome to come and speak with me if you are interested in any of these topics. Just to mention some of the benefits of participation, participation in those calls are mostly done in consortia of at least 3 partners from 3 different countries. So if as an Israeli company, small company or entrepreneur, if you participate in winning grants here, you get big funding that can reach dozens of millions of euros per project. You get an opportunity to take part in large demonstration activities in Europe. 1 more minute, do I have 1 minute? You get access, of course, to big business network. The grant, you don't have to give up any rights, you don't have to repay anything, and you have also access to new tool in Horizon 2020, which are subsidized loans from the European Investment Bank. Again, Israeli entrepreneurs, you are all entitled to enjoy this. And I'll just mention quickly that since the EU recently realized in recent years that they don't do well enough, they have a lot of new patents coming from universities. They're really leading in citations and academic research, but they don't do as well in transfer these ideas into innovation. And therefore, they formed the EIC, European Innovation Council, whose goal is to define new funding tools to promote innovation. And there is the new SME instrument, which is really a bottom-up program intended for small and medium enterprises, offering small grants, 50,000 for business plans, and also large grants for real research and innovation activities, up to 2.5 million per project. Space Pharma, who presented here before, were such a winner of such funding. So that's it. Thank you.